And we are live. What's up, STS Nation? 47 days. And finally, now we are on the road to justice today for Madison Mogan, 21, Kaylee Gonzalez, 21, Xana Kernodle, 20, and Ethan Chapin, 20. As you can see by our screen, we are standing by for the Moscow PD press conference that's set to start any moment. We have an incredible panel joining us today. We've got Phil Waters. He hates the word, but I'm going to use it today. A legendary detective with hundreds of homicide cases out of the Houston PD. You've got Jim Rathman. He's a former Secret Service agent that protected President Barack Obama, Vice President Joe Biden. He was a detective prior to that. He was a standout college football player. And we've got Troy Lambert, who is the stepfather of a just recently graduated U of I student. Welcome to one and all. And we are waiting for a few more people to pop up. It is good to see people joining the stream. Detective Phil Waters, age before beauty. What do you make of all this?
Well, the first thing I want to say is an amazing amount of kudos to the Moscow Police Department, the chief, their detectives, those agents with the state police and the FBI, all the folks behind the scenes processing that evidence that has led them to make the arrest of this evildoer. I can't tell you how elated I was to hear the news this morning.
Bill, I'm going to cut you off right there because we're going to take this presser live right now on
Okay, sure.
Magic of YouTube.
I recognize the frustration with the lack of information that's been released. However, providing any details in this criminal investigation might obtain the upcoming criminal prosecution or alerted the suspect of our progress.
Is the audio down or is it just me?
Provide as much information as we can as the process moves forward.
They're not hearing it.
Today, I want to specifically thank our dedicated Moscow Police Department detectives, patrol officers, the Idaho State Detectives, the Idaho State Troopers, and their crime lab technicians and scientists, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation for the resources and personnel to conduct this massive investigation. It was the dedication of them and the persistence and the numerous hours that led to the arrest.
The work is not done. But be sure the work is not done. This has just started.
To solve this case.
Since November, we have remained laser focused on pursuing every lead
Over the past
in
6
pursuit
weeks,
of justice.
I've been continually reminded of how much our community cares.
I recognize the frustration with the lack of information that's been released. However, providing any details in this criminal investigation might obtain the upcoming criminal prosecution or alerted the suspect of our progress. We will continue to provide as much information as we can as the process moves forward. Today, I want to specifically thank our dedicated Moscow Police Department detectives.
I'm reminded of our Moscow community, our families, the nation.
And individuals from across the nation.
We aren't getting the sound either.
Your primary source of factual information is going to be the court record, because that's what the Supreme Court said.
Certainly appreciate the support of the local community and our national audience that has been following us as we've worked, our investigators have worked through this case. I'm thankful also to you, the media partners, who have helped keep this case in the forefront that generates the tips and continues what we hope will continue to generate information that will help us to a conclusion of this proceeding. I'd like to express our appreciation on behalf of the Idaho State Police to Chief Frye, his leadership, and the entire Moscow Police Department for the way that they handled this from the very beginning. He directed the right people to the right positions that led us to this conclusion today. I've had the utmost confidence in this investigation and in Chief Frye, as well as in Mr. Bill Thompson and the Latah County Prosecutor's Office, who've been a great partner throughout this. Nothing has deterred the commitment of the investigators who've worked on this case, regardless of the organization they represent. It's been very trying, very difficult, as you know, that it has been on those investigators as they do the tedious work that they're so good at doing. The partnerships is what's led here as well. The partnerships between Moscow Police Department, I'd like to express our appreciation with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically the Special Agent in charge of the Salt Lake City Division, Dennis Rice, and also what the work that happened in the last 24 hours in Pennsylvania with the arrest with the Pennsylvania State Police and Colonel Evan Chick with the
Pennsylvania State Police. We appreciate
The mic is there. We go. We are live. Gentlemen, are you able to hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Apologize. There were some obvious technical issues both on our end and also on the YouTube stream. Phil Waters, a decorated detective out of the Houston PD, has to run in a few minutes. So right out of the gates, Phil, I don't know if you were able to hear that. I'd just like to get your reaction. When we left off, you wanted to throw some kudos the way of Moscow PD's Chief James Fry, who was under a lot of scrutiny and getting a lot of criticism as well. Your thoughts on the arrest today?
Well, just to reiterate what I started to say was the amazing work that was conducted in this investigation by the Moscow PD detectives with their chief, the state police, the agents with the FBI, and all of the support personnel that processed the evidence and cataloged it and took care of that part of it. I think that the arrest today, what it has told me is that what I have been trying to communicate all along in this is that be patient. These guys know what they're doing. And I was asked early on, do I have confidence in the Moscow PD and the investigation? And my response then was yes. And today proved that that was the right call. And I'm not saying that for my own aggrandizement. It's just reassuring to me that the due diligence was applied to this by everybody involved. And I think that with all of the things that were said in the negative about this police department, about the chief, and they're incompetent, they don't know what they're doing, they're this, they're that, and he needs to get out of the way, and some of them calling for his resignation, that kind of thing. I think today those people owe that agency, Moscow PD, that chief, and all of those special agents and state troopers and state detectives a huge apology, because all those things they were saying that were so disparaging did not help the investigation in any way, shape, or form. In fact, it may have hindered it in ways that we will never know. So we're still the good guys, and those guys, I'd be curious to see how many man hours were spent continually working this investigation that got us to this point. And I think that the chief just showed an amazing amount of grace to all of those people, the media included, and well-known media people that were out there disparaging him and his department. So I'm proud of those guys as a fellow law enforcement officer and as a homicide detective. Those guys, an amazing job. And look, I think in the what the chief was saying there, he talked about the darkness of this thing. Well, I'll tell you what, John 1:5 says, and the light shines into the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. So, amen. Good job, guys.
Very, very eloquently said. He was also the chief now. Chief James Fry was incredibly humble. He didn't seem to take much credit. Seems like a real team player. Very counterintuitive to a lot of the experts we heard. And I just want to underscore that. Detective Waters, before you have to jump to your next TV appearance, even though this one will be better for sure, tell us, where do we go from here? A conviction is a whole different story, but it sounds like they have their man, right?
Well, it does. I mean, look what happens here is we talked about this in the beginning. When I worked as a homicide cop, you had to let the evidence lead you where you need to be. You can't take it someplace you want it to go. And it's always about a journey for the truth. It's always about finding the right person who's done the wrong thing and bringing about serving justice and bringing about a measure of peace for these families. And I think we have just started on that road. And they were, the prosecutor, the chief are both correct when they say that this is a new beginning. This is where the investigation is going to start anew. They have enough probable cause to make this arrest. But now what they're doing is they're continuing to process evidence. They're continuing to ask for information about this. I don't even want to say his name. I don't even give him any recognition, but this evildoer.
Can I say one thing about that? Can I say one thing about that?
Yeah, sure.
Phil, Phil, I heard that earlier on television, and I think, well, I understand why you say that. I think we need to put that to the side with this guy, because we need people to come forward that know of him. And I think it's important that he's not a bomber who blew himself up or a mass murderer who went in and got caught, and we know exactly what he did. We need people to know this guy's name, I believe, so that if there's other people who have been victimized by this individual, if there's other people that we still don't know if anybody else may have been involved, I think it is important at this point that we know his name. And
well,
I'm not saying,
with all due respect, I was just talking about me.
Yeah,
so
I get.
I will let you and all the other guys get his name out there. But for me, I don't want to utter his name, and that is for me personally.
Yeah.
So
and I want to jump in there and say, Detective Phil Waters, I have the most respect in the world for you, for the service. You're a Marine. As a reporter, we did not like to report the name either. I respect that 1,000%. To Jonathan's point, I respect that as well.
Sure.
And police came out today and did say that they still need help with information about this individual. So I'm sure we will utter his name. And if you do have information about, and his name is on our screen right now, Bryan Kohberg, you are asked to send that in to the FBI or Moscow PD or Idaho State Police. But I do respect both of your opinions on that.
Well, to finish my answer there on the question that was asked, but so they're doing what they need to do, right? They are continuing now, and this is where this case, and they've said it continually in this presser, this is where this case, they start to shore up their evidence. They get as close to the truth as they can get. And this is the goal here is a successful prosecution and get this guy put where he needs to be. So kudos to the chief. I thought the press conference was amazing. I think he's gone through the crucible with his communication, and from the very beginning. And I think now you have seen a chief that has been, iron sharpens iron in deals like this. And I think that he is resolved. He's now in a place where he can get up there and he can confidently talk about this investigation, where they are, where they're headed. And he's not going to reveal parts of this investigation at this point in time. And he's sticking with that. And I think he's just done a fantastic job. My kudos to him.
Very well. I agree with that completely. I think this chief's done a good job, and he's sticking with exactly what has worked from the very beginning. And with a case such as this, you have got to keep those cards and what's critically important to the case close to the vest, something that they can link directly to the suspect and not anybody else. You're not, taking a future jury pool. They are specifically targeting exactly what they need on this individual right now. He's not going to give any more information than he needs to for that specific reason. They don't want to do anything to jeopardize this case at this point. I can assure you, if they made an arrest and charged him with 4 murders, they got something very, very solid. Yeah. Now what they need is the public's help to come forward with anything else about his whereabouts, what they know, his pattern. Maybe he said something to a friend of a crime that he wants to commit doing this earlier that hasn't come forward yet, where his whereabouts were, what his patterns are. There's a lot of information that can help the prosecution here put the finishing touches on this to ensure that this guy never sees the light of day again.
And for those of you who don't know Jim, he is new to our show and a welcome guest. He worked for the Secret Service protecting President Barack Obama and Vice President Joe Biden. He was a detective prior to that, so he's got some strong credentials. The one person we have not heard from yet is Troy Lambert, whose stepson just graduated from the University of Idaho. Troy happens to also write murder mysteries for a living. Troy, what was your reaction and your stepson's reaction to hearing this news about the arrest today?
Well, the first reaction was relief. Relief in kind of a number of ways. First of all, it's a certain amount of closure. Like, okay, now we know who did this. Even though I don't think that we have the complete story yet, but I think we know who did this, and that it's someone who, I mean, we can see some interesting patterns in this guy, some interesting potential patterns of why he might have done this. That puts him outside of, like, in other words, this wasn't another student that's roaming around the campus, or even an Idahoan, a real Idahoan who's here in this area that's a continual threat, things like that. So I think there's some more parts to the story. But I also wanted to echo what Phil said, in that one of the things that's been challenging this whole time is, as someone who's in Idaho, people saying, okay, that police chief isn't doing his job. And I'm like, yeah, he is. They can't tell you what's going on because we don't want to alert the suspect. We want to know who did this. We want closure. And so I think this police chief has done an outstanding job. When we were up in Moscow, there were state police constantly there. They had a headquarters down the street from where our stepson lives. They were constantly there putting in tons of hours. They were constantly watching that house, taking care of business the way they needed to take care of business. For us, it's just a huge relief. We know that now we're headed towards a resolution, at least. And I agree. Anybody with tips, the prosecution is now what's important. The guy made a mistake. Idaho's a death penalty state, and I would not be terribly upset to see him sitting on that particular death row in our local penitentiary.
Jonathan, your initial reaction to the arrest in terms of the profile of this individual. We all know he has a master's degree in criminal justice. He was getting his PhD in that field. It was shocking to me, and that is a news cliche, but it is valid here, I think. Was it shocking to you?
Well, it's interesting because he fit the profile that I came up with in a lot of ways, and I think many people agreed that it would be a male, that he would be younger and fit enough to carry out 4 murders, even if the people didn't fight back. It's still a tremendously draining undertaking to murder 4 people with a knife, and so he had to be young enough, fit enough to do that. I didn't think he would live more than 3 hours away, and most likely he lived even closer than that because of the time in which it occurred, the fact that he would be exhausted, and that he would want to get home before the sun came up in case there was any evidence on him. So all those things kind of played out. However, what I'm very interested to find out is, does he have a history of violent behavior? Because he's a major in criminal justice. He is a PhD student, and that kind of goes against what I was thinking that this person would be like, because I can't imagine that somebody who would carry out 4 murders like this in one night would not have done this before and would not have shown some type of psychopathic behavior or Machiavellian behavior, were very dominant and manipulative. So I really am interested in seeing what the background is of this guy once it unfolds. And then also I had, after Phil and I did the podcast last week, and I was thinking about all the things that Phil was saying and why there was no evidence that we could see at that point. And I started, for a moment, it went into my brain that, could this have been a police officer that did this? And there's been times when police officers went bad, or they were just bad and they got on the force. And so that kind of went in my brain a little bit, but then it went back out. And maybe that's a bias on my part, but it's very interesting that this is his major, and that there's been, I think Mark Furman was on Fox News earlier talking about how he had said some things on Reddit, I believe, and was talking about just going over some stuff about the criminal mind and these things and the way that they work, and almost as if he was exploring the way that criminals, the way that they work. So this guy, obviously, I mean, there's no doubt, regardless of his education level, that he's a psychopath. I don't think there's any doubt as far as that goes at all. But it is very interesting that he functioned in an environment probably more like Ted Bundy, who didn't have the outward appearance of somebody who was a psychopath. But I would like to find out in the end who this guy was, what were his relationships with people. And then also, I said this earlier, I've already gotten some people agreeing and some people disagreeing, but that picture that you have right there, I mean, that's a booking picture. He has just been arrested by a SWAT team and is being charged with 4 murders that's high profile. If you were, or I, or any of the people in this podcast were put in that position, I can guarantee you would see a drain on this person's face. You would see an emotional, like vacuum of energy. It's just exhausting. We've all arrested people. We've seen how it drains the person when they have to go and get their picture taken. I don't see that in this individual. I see somebody who is emotionless in this picture. And so a lot of these serial killers that we see, or a lot of these mass murderers, will have deadpan or crazy eyes. And I think it's going to go back, once this unfolds, that we will see that this individual had that type of characteristics or behaviors that other people had seen it in the past. And I think what we're looking at here is a behavior that this deadpan, emotionless type of behavior is probably something that he has had in the past and people have seen and just thought odd.
This guy has got what I call shark eyes. Jim, I'm going to get to you, I promise. But I'm just elated to see that Phil Waters is still here. Phil, your real expertise is the interview room. I know you don't like the word interrogation. They're talking to this guy right now. If you're in that room, how do you begin to speak to him, to get him to provide the information you want?
Well, we talked about this before, and it may sound strange, but if it were I going into this interview room, I would treat him with dignity and respect, just like I would anyone. I would remember those 3 things that we all have in common. And I would begin to establish that relationship with him based on those things that I use in that interview room. I also understand every time I enter that interview room, again, referring back to the darkness and light, that I was entering the darkness and it was my job to bring the light into that setting. So in sitting down with somebody like this, this is not a stupid individual. You've got to do some preparation for a guy like this, for anybody for that matter. But, we had an old saying in the Marines, proper prior preparation prevents piss poor performance. And with a guy like this, you have really got to be prepared, because he is going to think he's the smartest guy in the room. And when I look at this picture of him, I've looked in the eyes of people just like him. And what I see is an inherent evil within this guy. The look on his face, to me, looks to be one of arrogance. I'm with Jonathan. He's not showing. In fact, he almost shows like he's been revitalized in a sense, that now his work is going to be put out here for all to see, and he's going to be acknowledged for what he did. And even though it is the most horrific, negative way of being acknowledged for something, but I think it will be interesting to find out where he came from and kind of the path that he took to get to this place. He may be a person where this has been, it's amazing that his entire academic career has been focused on criminal justice, which is pretty striking. And the fact that some of this evidence and so forth that was collected, it may have taken so much time to get it, because he may have, he knows what the police are going to do in a sense. And he may have done some things that caused this investigation to go on longer. So before there was an arrest. And, in terms of his proximity, I mean, I've read where he was a student there at Washington State, which is, I think, is in Pullman, Washington, which is about 8 miles away. So there is some association. I would assume that students from University of Idaho and from Washington State, they mingled. They crossed paths all the time in the social settings and so forth. And so somewhere along here, it's going to be interesting to see where he crossed paths with Kaylee and Madison and Ethan and Xana. It's just going to be interesting to see. And then find out what it was that set this off. He may have been a guy sitting on a Tinder, just waiting for a moment like this, and it just needed something to light that fuse. And obviously, whatever happened, he may not have a history of other violent activities. He may have some weirdness about him that people may talk about, but the possibility is this could be the first time that whatever he's kept inside of him, that anger, resentment, feeling insulted, lack of respect, whatever that may have been, because he's 28 years old. He's a little bit older than the kids that are involved in this thing. So something in him got set off that night and manifested itself into what he ultimately did.
And Jim, I'm curious from your perspective, how are things complicated by the fact, from an investigative standpoint, by the fact that he is a criminal justice PhD student? He knows he knows forensics, presumably. He knows crime scenes, presumably. I would think it makes it more challenging to interrogate a guy like this.
Well, for sure. I mean, much to Phil's point, you have to prepare for an interview like this. You can't just go in, walk in, and just start talking. You have to literally do your homework. We know that in order for him to be in a PhD program, he's got a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, so he's going to be highly intelligent. But I kind of look at this as somebody that may have chosen this path for the simple, of being a criminal justice major, for the simple fact of being almost like a counterintelligence expert. He's gathering his intel about how law enforcement processes a crime scene, what are the latest and greatest techniques, where they can go. So if he was a career criminal or looking to do this, as an example, you look at serial killer Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. He worked in law enforcement. So some of these people are able to bypass the law enforcement process to get in, or they go and they study something like this. So that way they can try their best to go around law enforcement to try to not get detected when they commit these types of crimes. So I find that very well could be one of the reasons why he became a criminal justice major. This may have been the first crimes. His may have been the first set of murders he's ever done. He may have done a series of them before and hasn't been caught yet. But we don't really know. What I will say is hats off to the Moscow PD, the state of Idaho, and the FBI for working together on this in order to bring resolution to this case, because they did one heck of a job. This chief did this under the most intense scrutiny, and probably one of the most intense scrutinies I've seen in a very long time, not just from his own state, but on an international stage at this point. And he's kept calm. Guarantee that guy hasn't slept more than a couple hours a night for the last several weeks. You could tell his heart and soul's into it. I've heard everything from he's smiling too much. No, that could be a nervous smile. At the same time, it could be because he started smiling because he knew, I got you and we're coming for you. I also want to bring up one other thing too. If you look at that booking photo, he's wearing a vest. So that kind of tells me he might be on suicide watch at this point. So who knows what it was that he said. He could have said some excited utterances when law enforcement first encountered him. I don't know if it's true or not about him saying, have you arrested the other people yet? Maybe he's just saying that to throw somebody off. But I will absolutely agree with the other members on this panel that when you look at that booking photo, I don't see somebody that's remorseful. I don't see somebody that's, overly stressed out about the whole entire situation. You're dealing with a psychopath, and I 100,000% agree with that.
We're going to get to these questions. Jim Rathman is a college football standout. He talks like a teammate, and I know you guys take it personally, and I'm glad that it is a good day today for Chief James Fry.
Joe, can I ask one question before we move forward?
100%. Keep that thought for one split second. So Jim mentioned BTK. I just want to tell you, we had the woman on who studied BTK. She wrote the book on him, And she was a professor, still is, at DeSales University. I reached out to her today to come on, and she told me, hey, I can't speak publicly. This guy was my student. Bryan Kohberger was her student, and she's not allowed to talk about it.
Whoa.
But what a small world. Go ahead, Jonathan.
So I just want to get everybody's take on this. If they had any thoughts, as soon as I was on the news when somebody read that that he had said that he did you am I the only one you arrested, or did you arrest anybody else? And as soon as he said that, for some reason in my brain, looking at this guy, knowing his background, what popped into my brain was a female, and I just kind of got this weird feeling if it's possible that somebody he's involved with had a beef with these girls, or that he had a fixation with them and so did she, but that a female may be involved with this. That's the only type of person that I think I would see this guy developing a relationship with to kill. I don't see him developing a relationship with another guy to go and carry these things out, but I could see him with a girl, and it could possibly fit the fact that these people were so popular. So anyway, I just want to get anybody else's take on that. It just popped into my brain. It may not be anything, but I thought it was very interesting.
Troy, jump in there, and then we're going to get to this first question.
So let me jump in with the fact that I have heard rumor here in Idaho, and I haven't seen on the news anywhere, that there have been other people arrested in Moscow, and it hasn't hit the news yet. But from my understanding, both those other people are males. Okay. So that's an interesting take of things. I don't know if these things are related for sure or not. The other things that I can tell, speaking to what you were talking about students going back and forth from Moscow to Pullman and stuff like that, and it happens all the time. And there's a couple simple reasons for it. First of all, marijuana is legal recreationally in Washington and not in Idaho. And you can imagine that all college students, I'm sure, abide by the legal requirements of that, but that's you know what I'm saying, clearly they go back and forth, but parties go back and forth all the time as well. Both universities are because they're so close, the students know each other from different universities. There's also a rumor that his sister lived relatively close to the house, that Bryan's sister lived relatively close to the house. I don't know if that's true either, but that rumor has been floating around as well. So there could be any number of things happening here.
So already it'll be things bubbling to the surface about his past. I saw one anonymous post that's allegedly from him, which is much too graphic and much too disturbing for me to post here, but I could share with you guys offline. But if it is in fact from him, it goes to show what a twisted mind this person has. But he did put out a questionnaire during his graduate school studies, and it is essentially basically an expose and questions about how to get away with murder. Detective Waters, how important would that be to the case? And are you looking at those questions before asking him questions?
That is information I would want to know going into that interview room, because a guy like this, and anybody that I ever interviewed, was we performed what we call the psychological autopsy. And I want to know how this guy ticks. I want to know what might set him off and what might calm him down, what might make him more open. And many times you have that information, and when you make your approach to this person, you don't want to approach this guy as though you know everything. You want to appeal to his level of intelligence, or at least the level of intelligence that he believes he has. You don't want to be insulting with a guy like this. You want to play off of their ego. And like a Ted Bundy, that guy, smart guy, and he got into the process where he enjoyed explaining how he did what he did, and the motivation behind it, and how he used to dress up and put a cast on his arm, and the stuff that he would do. And hopefully they'll get someone that's got some real world experience in interviewing in there to talk to this guy. This is not somebody that you want to use as a training ground for the interview process. So I think it's what Jonathan says is interesting. I've thought about the possibility of another person being involved in this. I didn't get it down to a female necessarily, but I believe just the way the information was put out about the Elantra, that there may have been a driver, and that was why they were talking about the people inside that vehicle rather than the person. And so words have meaning, and you have to listen to kind of the nuances that are put out there. I think it's very interesting that where does he end up? At Mommy and Daddy's in Pennsylvania. And so I have read where now we're going to get into this stuff about how much did they know and when did they know it. So here we go. I'm sure the parents are going to be interviewed, are going to be debriefed, and so forth and so on. And it's going to be an interesting journey now to see how this story unfolds.
Phil, it's interesting you mentioned that. A source sent me something from the Pocono Record, which is where the mother and presumably the father live. This is allegedly the mother. She wrote a letter to the Pocono Record titled, and this is back in May, "I pray we consider the children before the gun." And I think she wrote this after the Uvalde mass shooting. A woman with a conscience, unlike apparently her son. Curious what you think of that.
Okay, say that again. Now, what
she wrote a letter after the Uvalde mass.
The mother did.
The mother did to the Pocono newspaper, and the headline was, "I pray we consider the children before the gun." So basically, a children's rights activist, head of gun rights. It seems like she had a conscience, and it seems like her son doesn't have one. What do you make of that, especially going into the interview room?
Well, you got to be careful there if you don't know what the relationship is between his mother and him and that kind of thing. I mean, some of this may have gone back to, Mommy didn't love me enough kind of stuff. So you got to be careful when you start bringing up unknowns into the interview room. You want to, if you can get enough information about him. And look, what I always did and what I always preach about in an interview room is you can find a common ground with just about anyone. And if you show some empathy toward that person, I know this sounds bizarre sitting in a room with a murderer, but you have to show a degree of empathy to that person you're talking to, because they have got to be able to trust you enough to tell you why they did and what they did, this most horrific act that they've committed. And you do that by sharing a little bit of yourself. I know that when I would find that something that I had in common with that person, I interviewed a capital murder suspect. He was out killing cab drivers for money because he enjoyed it. Well, he had been in the Navy. Prior to that, he had been discharged, because he didn't make it. And I was in the Marines. So what was the first thing I talked to him about? I talked about our shared military experience. And that gets me on a pathway to being able to talk to him. And he knows that we have something in common, even though we are, just to look at us, we are completely different. So this is going to, what I'm praying and hoping for is that they get a strong interviewer who has experience in interviewing people like this involved in these most horrific crimes, because it's going to be, starting out, it's going to be a cat and mouse kind of process. And then once the interviewer and this guy can kind of have a relationship there and start to build that trust, it may take hours to do that. But I will bet you that if he's willing to speak with the detective, with the interviewer, that they're going to be in there for a while. That would be my guess.
STS Nation is faithful. I've got a question for Jim. And I've got a question for Jonathan. I've got a million questions, and I've got a question for Troy. Real quickly, just some news of the day. So this 28-year-old had his initial appearance, no bond. He's back in court in Pennsylvania Tuesday afternoon. Idaho is going to proceed with extradition, and police are asking for tips. If you know anything about him, probable cause, they say, is sealed till he is extradited. The first question comes from Janet, and we will do this rock and roll for as long as we have the energy to go. Could he have used, meaning the killer, alleged killer, his research to recruit lookouts or co-conspirators? He feels like a solo psychopath, but is this possible? Jonathan, I'll throw that one to you. Is it possible that he was playing people, and that's maybe why he said, was anyone else arrested, according to reports?
Well, one of the characteristics of these types of people is that they are masters at walking into a room. A lot of them, not all of them, but they're masters at walking into a room and reading a room and looking for injured or weak people. When you look at Klebold and Harris in the Columbine murders, you know, I keep forgetting which one was which, but I think was it Harris that was the follower, if I'm correct on that. One of them was the follower and one of them was the leader, and the other one did whatever the other one said to do. So it's always possible for this to happen. I think the fact that he is a PhD student, which means that he's probably working as an aide in the school at some point and developing this superior and subordinate relationship with people. If he identifies somebody that's a little off and he cultivates and grooms them, that's possible. I know that everybody that's ever been a cop will tell you that it's the strangest thing. You could take two crack addicts that have never been to a city before, put them on opposite ends of that city, and within about 2 weeks, they will find each other somehow, some way, and they will, they'll become bonded. So I think that's possible in this case. It happens less often. I think Klebold and Harris and those types of relationships are not as often. So, but most people that do these things are not in a position of authority, which this guy is. And I think a good example of it would be gang members. Gang members often commit heinous crimes, but because they're, the senior gang member or whatever you want to call them, they can get people to do things with them that maybe wouldn't normally do these things. But I think there's one other thing I want to point out is that this guy doesn't look like an incel. So a lot of people were saying that he looked like an incel. I don't think he fits that model. I didn't think that the behavior of this person fit that. They're typically weak individuals. That's why they're involuntarily celibate. And so I didn't think that really fit it. And I think looking in that picture, I don't see incel in this person.
We're like the Brady Bunch. Our family keeps growing. Dr. Debbie Goodman just popped in. She teaches criminology at a university, St. Thomas, I believe it is, in Southern Florida. Jim, I was going to ask you, you're the guy that's, you and Gillum, both of you are super fit dudes. What struck me as the son of a psychiatrist and the son of a social worker, there's already a side-by-side photo of this guy's booking shot and his high school picture. And in high school, I hate to use this term and people are going to yell at me, but he was a fat kid. He was chubby, out of shape. What factor, if any, does this have in shaping the person who he became? I assume he was probably mocked, maybe ridiculed, maybe even bullied. Is that something you're interested in from an investigative standpoint, or something you just don't care about?
Well, I think, in this particular case, they're trying to go to me, that it seems like they might be going for the death penalty here. So they charge him with first-degree murder. So you want to establish that timeline. You want to be able to establish why it is and how to get to that point, because at the end of the day, if you're going to charge him with first-degree murder, you want to get a conviction on that. So setting the stage and building the picture for it. So if he was overweight and was picked on a lot and bullied and started getting very violent, maybe, he was starting to take it out on somebody, of less stature than him. Maybe he started picking on people as he was getting older, started picking on younger people, maybe hurting animals, various things to kind of build into that aggression that he eventually got into as he became an adult. So I think that can start building a picture for it for sure. So that is definitely something I'd want to know. A point I want to make earlier, we were talking about his report in regards to how to get away with murder, right? Again, that kind of goes back to a little bit of counterintelligence. He may pick up some new tip, some new idea, a way to evade law enforcement on how to do his crime. It's very possible he could have found somebody that agrees in the same thing as him and could have been a co-conspirator in this. We're not really sure, but again, that could be a way for him to have gathered intelligence. And then lastly, I know Troy brought up that there's possibly 2 people that may have been arrested. Was it today, Troy? Is that what you're
today?
I believe it was.
Yeah.
So it'd be interesting what those charges are, because either they're going to be attached to this murder, so they're going to get a murder charge themselves, or conspiracy to commit murder, or are they charged with lying to law enforcement and trying to throw the investigation off? So I'll be really curious to see what those charges are exactly, because law enforcement very well could have been on this case much sooner than we thought, and because these people lied to them, that ended up coming back to bite them, and now they're arrested for this as well. So we're all going to have to wait another week to really see what's in that affidavit. But yeah, great question.
And Dr. Goodman, we're going to get to you in a moment, but I want to give Troy another chance here. Troy, you're the one that mentioned the death penalty. We've got a comment up here from Crypto Man 5000, who's now probably Crypto Man 2500. Does anyone on the panel want to comment about the chances for a federal death penalty because he crossed state lines, like Gary Lee Sampson? I know you're not an attorney, Troy, but in addition to being the parent of the stepfather of a child who just graduated from the University of Idaho, this is stuff that you study very seriously as an author. But just wondering your thoughts on this question.
I don't know that it would actually be necessary, simply because Idaho's a death penalty state and he's going to be tried here. And more than likely, prosecutors would go for the death penalty. That's kind of my assumption at this point for this heinous of a crime. But is it possible that he could be, that there's a chance for a federal death penalty? Sure, maybe he'll get a double conviction or something along that line. I'm not an attorney, so I don't know how that works. But I do know that in the state of Idaho, death penalty is still here, and we're not shy about using it in certain cases. There was one of the only first women on death penalty was here, and because she basically lit her house on fire with her family inside, and she is no longer with us. So I'm perfectly content for him to sit on Idaho's death row for as long as necessary before,
Joel, I don't think there's a federal nexus here for the federal death penalty.
I don't think so either. It's not like he, dumped the body across state lines or something like that. That would clearly justify it. I think he just came in there, committed the crime, and tried to abscond justice and flee.
Yeah.
And Phil, to you before we get to Dr. Goodman, authorities are, right as we speak, apparently executing a search warrant on his Pullman residence. Detective, what are they looking for there? And is this how things normally go? When I first saw this, I thought, wow, I'm surprised they didn't execute this search warrant earlier, but does it always come at the time of the arrest?
No, they're doing exactly what they should be doing. We're now seeing the timing of these search warrants being executed. The first thing, and I've done the same thing, and it is the way to strategically get this person into custody. You don't want to shoot your wad on running a search warrant over here when you don't have this person in custody over there. So the first thing they did, which is exactly what they should have done, which was get him in custody. I would imagine and I know I saw where they have seized the Elantra from the parents' residence. I would imagine that they're going to execute not only a search warrant on the Elantra, but they'll execute one on the parents' residence. They'll execute one, and they're doing that now on the Pullman residence. So any piece of property that they have an affirmative link to him, they are going to execute those search warrants on those things. I would imagine they have seized his cell phone. So that'll require another search warrant to get into that cell phone and dump any pertinent information that may be in there. If they're depending on who the provider is, there may be a possibility that there could be a preservation of some of those text messages and so forth and so on to get a bigger dump on whatever they get out of that cell phone. So this, we've said from the beginning, very complicated investigation, multifaceted, a lot of moving parts. And it just appears to me from the outside looking in, they're now moving forward with the right movement to get this investigation shored up. So I do want to say something about the this guy and my curiosity at this point. I talked about a psychological autopsy on this guy. So my curiosity now is, what is his relationship to those 4 young people? Was it one person that he was mad at? Was it the group? Because you got to remember how it kind of unfolded, where you had Ethan and Xana coming from a party, going into the second floor bedroom, and then you have Kaylee and Madison showing up later with an Uber driver. So they don't all come together at the same place, and they're not in the same place at the beginning of the night, and yet they all suffer the same consequence. So I'm really curious to see who was the relationship with that caused this guy to go in and commit this horrific act of evil.
When things are this fluid, you report information and it changes, but already we're seeing snapshots of his Instagram and his Facebook where he was following on social media these young women. Dr. Goodman, you've been waiting patiently. You study the criminal mind. Is this who you were expecting?
Well, first and foremost, allow me to thank you, Joel, Carmela, Steve, as always, for the pleasure and privilege of joining, and now these esteemed colleagues with whom I'm interacting. Thank you, the 4 of you, for all that you do in our field of crime, law, and justice. It's really sincerely recognized and appreciated. So for me as a criminologist, I like to look at 4 areas, if you will, at the very onset of a crime of this heinous, horrific magnitude. So I look at criminology, sociology, psychology, victimology, and I'll save the victimology piece for last. Criminology, of course, is always about the why. Why did this individual commit this act of terror against these 4 victims? And as our colleague said, what relationship, if any, is there? I think there is one, and we'll get to that. The sociology piece, of course, is what's going on in his world, meaning, is he a student? Does he work? What was the tipping point for him? Was there some kind of discord, anything financial relative to him making this decision? As we move into psychology, the thinking there for me always at the very, first hour of hearing about something so atrocious as our mass murder, mens rea actus reus, for me, mens rea is always about the criminal mind. Did this person intend to do what he did? First half. Second half, the actus reus. We don't know what's in anybody's mind unless he articulates it to somebody. So I do believe at some level that will be revealed. There will be some conversation he may have had, either complimentary or not, with somebody. That I'm sure is forthcoming, or our law enforcement experts already know that. And then also with psychology, is there any type of actual valid mental health issue for him? Psychosis, neurosis, schizophrenia. I think that will be forthcoming. Was there any type of psychotropic drug and or hallucinatory or any of those areas to be forthcoming? And then lastly, and purposefully for me, is the victimology piece. And Joel, I'm delighted that we've had several conversations thus far. And I'm so, again, glad to be interacting with our viewers too, who I've come to know and respect in their very thoughtful types of questions, and they email me on LinkedIn, and I take time to answer. So here would be my thinking at this moment, which was an early onset thought, is the victimology piece here is very similar, of course, within the dynamic of the four. Why? Because they're all college students. They're all 20, 21-year-olds. They're with the same goal, the same purpose. So now the question becomes, with whom do they interact? And we've talked about that on the earlier shows, where we've suggested, well, certainly there's that first group of their friends, their family, really an inner circle. Well, those individuals were ruled out very early on by our law enforcement experts. Then we go to that next circle, people with whom our victims may have been associated, either within the network of the school place and the workplace and the community and the neighborhood. But I felt strongly then, Joel and our colleagues and our viewers, and I feel very strongly now, is that the victimization piece and the matching up, if you will, of similar age groups. He's 28 years old. He's a graduate student. Even if we look at data analytics, just purely going by that, when we look at the data on who are these mass murderers, and it's a little different, by the way, than the mass shooter. The mass murder, he uses, as we say, we don't have it yet, but the fixed blade knife. But they tend to be within a similar circle. So I feel very strongly that this individual knew our victim and or victims through social media platforms. As I've said before, the fan, the fantasy, the fanatic. Here we are. I think that is the platform here. He was a fan of somebody. He led into fantasy type thinking, and then at the closure here made a decision to act in a fanatic way and taking the lives of the innocent.
Jonathan, I assume they are going to be looking very heavily at all of his social media. A lot of it has already been taken down. I've got a question from Frankie. I got to be honest, I'm a little slow on the uptake. I don't fully understand the question, but I'll read it and let you see if you understand it. Oh, and you just switched on me.
I saw it.
You saw the question. Go ahead, Jonathan. Yeah. Answer that about the multiple weapons.
Right. Well, I think when the chief is making statements, I think that was what it was about. Was the chief made a statement about we haven't found a weapon or weapons? I think that comes down to you don't want to give specifics away about what you believe from an investigative standpoint. I think it's probably about as simple as that. And so I think when law enforcement makes certain statements, they have to be very guarded in what they're saying. And, the only way I can give an example, I think, for everybody to understand is that when you're young and and you do something wrong and your parents ask you, what did you do? You'll minimize, right? Well, there's two places where you see minimization in law enforcement. One is from the criminal who tries to minimize what they've done. And the other is law enforcement when they have to give information to the public. They're going to minimize what they have to give. Two different reasons, but very similar in the way that they don't tell the whole story, because you don't want a lot of times for that story to develop before you get a chance to process and actually work the case out. One thing I just want to say about the federal nexus is that if this person has carried out these types of crimes before, now that they have a route to where his house is, apparently he drove there. So if he's driven there once, he's probably driven there before. So now that they have a route, and now that they have him and his phone records, they can now track where this individual has been. And if they find other crimes that fit this type of a profile somewhere where he's been, then you're going to see a federal nexus. And that is where you'll see this case really expand beyond Moscow, Idaho. And there's a possibility of that. If they're doing their due diligence, they're going to look at all his phone records and they're going to see, who is this guy? They're going to go back and see, was he a larger child who was bullied when he was younger? And when did he change? When did he lose that weight? Did he just grow out of it? Or was there a moment in time when people say, well, he just changed. He lost his weight and he became more aggressive. So they're going to, hopefully they'll look at all those different things, and they won't just stop at the fact that they solved the Moscow murder, which has happened before in cases where they solve something and they just stop right there. And so I would like to see this fully investigated and the breadth and scope of all this, and hopefully, because the FBI is involved, they will take this information and they will run with it, because they can do that. They can actually open up their own case and actually start diving into this separate from what they have. Now they have the ability to do that.
And Jim, I presume you think this will be fully investigated. Mary Blues has a question here. What if he, the alleged killer, refuses extradition?
Can refuse extradition all you want. All you're doing is delaying the inevitable. It's not like he's in another country. So if he refuses, then what will happen is the state of Idaho will then go ahead and start with proceedings to have him extradited back to Idaho. And it's only a matter of time before the judge signs off on it, and off you go. So he's just delaying the inevitable at this point. If that's what he chooses to do, he'd just be better off just waiving extradition and go ahead and going through the process.
And
can I say one thing real quick?
Sure.
That question right there that just popped up. I know that Phil and I had talked about this, and also Joseph Scott Morgan also talked about this. That house should have never been touched. And this is a perfect example of why. Mm-hmm. Because now the court had to put a freeze on that, so they can't go in there and touch anything else. They already started to clean it. I know I've had pushback from different detectives and agents that have said, once you get what you need out of it, you let the house go. But in this case, those people were not returning back to that house. There was nobody returning back there. The girls downstairs, yes, their stuff was in there, but upstairs, nobody was returning back to that house. So they could have froze that in place. If they thought that they might be getting some leads that are worth it, they should have frozen that house and saved it there. This is where you have to look beyond catching somebody. You have to, as if Phil will tell you, you cannot just do an investigation to catch someone. You have to do investigation, and the prosecutors will always bring you back to this. You are also investigating for the prosecution of this individual. And you can do a great case and lock somebody up, and then they will win their case because you did not take the time to do the proper collection of evidence, or you screwed something up along the way. You didn't read the rights properly. So you get the guy, but you mess up the prosecution. So I really hope that this is not the case. And all the information that's been out over the past 5 weeks, 6 weeks of how bad the Moscow Police Department is, defense attorneys, it doesn't matter if it's news people or if it's a family. The fact that they were condemning this police department, a defense attorney will 100% guarantee that they will use that to make that department sound like they're less competent.
The real
you can pretty much guarantee on this that anything collected this day going forward, any criminal defense attorney is going to go ahead and challenge because it technically could have been tampered with. That's the unfortunate part. So hopefully they collected enough good, solid, tangible evidence. They collected all their samples correctly. They cut out their pieces of carpet. Whatever it is that they were doing within that residence was collected correctly before they had to have a court order to go ahead and stop this. Jonathan's 100% correct on that. And, I know a lot of people get real mad because it takes so long to get information, but you only have one true shot at the crime scene. And so you have to be very meticulous about how you go through it and how you use your DNA swabs, and everything that you're doing has to be done right. And it also has to be done right in the crime lab itself, because if they rush it and they mess up that sample, that could have been the only true sample you had, and you can't go back and recreate it. So, not allowing anybody inside that house, keeping that house completely guarded would have been the smartest thing to do at this point, but hopefully they collected enough on the front end.
You want to see a good example of that.
Look, they've been processing this house for 7 weeks. So I'm comfortable that they've got the evidence they need. What we don't know, and what has not been shared yet, is when it says the court has stopped the remediation. Well, that's the DA that has gone in there and made a motion to have this cleaning process stopped for whatever reason, and we don't know that reason. So I'm just hoping that it is something that is the DA felt that they needed to shore up. I don't think we've somehow come upon a new piece of evidence that we didn't see in 7 weeks of processing this scene. So I don't look at this as being a negative. And of course, I agree with Jonathan. Defense. Look, in a case like this, and in the way this thing I think is going to end up in terms of the prosecution of it. And this is the outside looking in, of course. I don't see whoever the defense attorneys are going to have a rough road to hoe for this guy. And they are going to pull out anything they can. They're going to be grasping at anything they can. They're going to be looking at mitigation. I mean, if he was to Joel, to use your term you used earlier, if he was a fat boy growing up and he was getting ridiculed every day and blah, 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 and his mom didn't treat him right. I mean, they can come up with all this crap to explain his particular mental illness. And they're going to use that as some kind of mitigation into explaining why he did what he did. It still does not mean that he is going to be acquitted for what he did based on that. It doesn't make him not responsible for what he did. So I guess I'm always the guy that, the glass is not always half full or half empty. It's overflowing. And I just, I don't take this court order to stop this remediation process at this point as necessarily negative. I think that something that the DA's office decided, wait a minute, we need to hold up just a second and let's go check this thing, and then we'll move on.
The real victims, obviously, are the 4 young college students who were murdered, and then the collateral damage was the community, right? Troy, I'm just curious, your stepson just graduated. I know you mentioned this a little bit off the top. If you could just rehash, did you call your stepson today? Did you speak to him on the phone? Could you tell us a little bit about what the conversation was like?
Yeah, so actually I was texting with him and texting with his girlfriend today, and they were the ones that let me know that there were actually other people that were arrested in Moscow. And for them also, this was just a huge relief. I mean, I think their biggest concern was, is this someone that's still out there? Because even though both of them now are technically done with college, they don't have to go back. They have friends that are there. They have friends that are returning to college and returning to college within a couple of weeks there. So I think it was the big question to the chief of whether the community is now safe. That was something they're really concerned about. Is this now a place that we can return and we and our friends can return safely and not worry? But I think there's still a heightened level of security. I was going to speak to the fact of the crime scene cleaning. It was my understanding from the local perspective that was actually stopped before it started today. Like the prosecutor, they went and did the arrest, and the prosecutor said, okay, no, we had you scheduled, but we're canceling the schedule. So I don't think the house was touched. While we were up there, the house was. Yeah,
from what I understand, that is the case. They stopped. They did not clean the home.
They didn't touch. They didn't touch anything. When we were up there, the house was, it was extremely guarded. Like there were officers there pretty constantly. You couldn't get close to the house. When you look at that picture of the house, up on the left-hand side of that picture is exactly where my stepson's apartment complex was. And so they were that close, and you couldn't really get much closer than that, other than giving people access to that area. So Jim, it was pretty well protected.
This question here from Ben Starnes.
Joel, I've got a bug out. Sorry to interrupt you.
Detective Phil Waters, you're a legend in all our minds. Appreciate your insight. Thank you so much. Appreciate the time.
Appreciate you having me on here, and
we'll do it again next week. Every Saturdays, you get your True Crime Phil with Phil Waters. The question here, Jim. Could these seemingly legitimate critiques of don't touch the crime scene be traced back to the prosecutor's potential incompetence, or is this a grossly unfair comment here, Jim?
I think that's an unfair comment. From what I heard from this prosecutor today, it seems anything but incompetent. He's going to allow the law enforcement officials to collect what needs to be collected. That's not really what his role is. His role is going to be to take the information that comes to him and making sure it has legal standing with how it was collected, what's gone about, and how he can go ahead in front of a judge and a jury and try this case for conviction. So that's what the prosecutor's goal is going to be here. I think that's an unfair statement, and I don't think that comments on the critiquing of collection has anything to do with that.
And this comment here from Adam Rosenduft. I'm curious, how will they find the murder weapon? It could be anywhere between Idaho and Pennsylvania. How do the police go about that? Jonathan, that's a pretty key piece of evidence.
Right. That's going to be difficult. I mean, good investigators are going to piece together where this individual was. And first thing they try to do is find it. Like look in the grates, look in his personal property, look in his car that he had. Did he take it and drop it somewhere along the way? Is there any video footage? See, now you have a path where you can go pick up video footage. Now that you know where he was and you know that where he lived that night, they can go and pick up video footage if it's still there of which they probably have collected, that now they have this route, right? They know that he went from the murder scene to here. And so now they can start piecing this stuff together, reverse engineering that, and then forward engineering where he went from his house, all these places until he went to Pennsylvania. So good investigative work, you might be able to find it that way. What unfortunately happens in a lot of these cases is that, which they don't have to have a murder weapon in order to convict this guy. But I hope that doesn't get to the point where they make a plea deal with this guy from the death penalty to life, or something like that, where he then tells them these things. And that is the case, which you will probably see if they find out he has done more than just these killings. If they start to find out that he's killed more than just these 4 individuals, then you'll start to see plea deals come out that takes the death penalty off, so that they can then collect more and more information on who he's killed and who all is involved in these different things. But granted, he's 28 years old. I would suspect that somebody like this, if they started killing, there's very few records of people doing, a serial type killing below the age of 17. I mean, we just don't usually, typically it's a little bit older. And so that really does ratchet down the amount of years that this guy's had to have done these things. So it's not going to be like a Jeffrey Dahmer or the Green River Killer or these types of people. Although Ramirez, the Zodiac Killer, he was a Zodiac Killer. He wasn't that old, and he killed a massive amount of people in the period of time that he killed. So that's the way that goes. I mean, it's these investigations and the way they work out. What I hope all these people, including the sleuths that are online that have tried to eviscerate me because of what I said before about Kaylee Gonzalez's father, it's very important that investigators, one, do not rule anyone out as a subject, and then they clear them and move on. And two, that they don't allow the public or politicians to push an investigation forward faster than the evidence is coming in. And the third part of this is, once the evidence comes in, let your egos go. Maybe you got this part wrong. Maybe you were wrong about this, but you let that go. And then you work on developing that case. Do we have all the killers? Do we have enough evidence to prosecute this individual? And you systematically work that out. You look at, for instance, The Staircase. I know everybody wants to watch these true crime shows. You watch The Staircase, you had a blood expert who was not really an expert, who made up evidence in order to help prosecutions. That is not what you want. Slow, systematic, and ruling things out so that you can hone in on this person. And I think that's what's happened here. That's what's occurred. And I hope it's what continues to occur.
Someone commented, saw Jim Rathman on a different show. Great guest. He is, and he's going to be back, I hope. He just happened to get in with us on a frenetic day. It's not always like this. Jim, this comment right here is from my lovely mother, who somehow found her way onto YouTube using her sister's name. She always likes to go incognito. And she writes, and she is a licensed therapist, I do not think this is the killer's first murder. Dr. Goodman, do you agree with my mom?
Well, I have such high regard and respect for Mrs. Waldman. And I think it's possible. Remember, when we analyze these issues, we've got the possibilities and the probabilities. So I think it could be either or. I'm leaning more toward this being the individual's first mass murder. And if I may, Joel, I'd like to provide some commentary as well on the points made by the colleagues. First of which, before Phil signed off and he was talking about mitigating aggravating conditions, I think this is a prosecutor's case, right down, letter to the law, checking off every box here from, again, what we know, much more to come and to be revealed. But thus far, it is absolutely first-degree murder ×4, planning, premeditation, willful, with malice. What possible mitigating condition could a defense attorney come up with here? Even if we go back to some of the points made and there was some type of disruption or discord in the childhood. He's a 28-year-old man. He is now in a capacity to make decisions. Hence, I think this was a decision made with a great deal of planning and purpose, and he carried it out. The issue about the house, that concerned me when I heard that, because I reside here in South Florida and I've been very involved for almost now rounding the corner on 5 years. I don't like to use the names of these killers. For me, it puts them in a spotlight and it's a sense of enjoyment when they hear their name and they feel some level of grandiosity. But we've concluded here the Parkland shooter case, mass shooting, horrendous, out of school, 17 victims. And so, as we all recall, that building, the main building of which these murders took place, that was preserved for that length of time, almost 5 years. So I feel the same way about this house. I really feel strongly, and I'm glad the decision was made to keep it intact and have the preservation and not, go forward with any type of remediation and cleaning. And about the safety and security now of those who have children, and many of us are parents who have sent or presently have children in college. And, to that issue, I always say that we're in our field. We love our profession, but we're also passionate about it. And wherein lies the passion of safety, security, and survival. So I would still maintain that we heard from the chief, we heard from the prosecutor, we heard from the director and such, and there's still this call to action. And I feel that's a critical point to be made. Perhaps the other colleagues shared it before I joined, but there's still a call to action from our law enforcement experts and officials who, by the way, I think have done just a magnificent job here. I know there was some criticism and, contrary thought, and people would email me, well, Dr. Debbie, is this case going cold? I never thought so for 1 minute. It's a very complex case. It's, ideally, would we like a case that's the 48-hour, the couple of days, or 10 days in? Of course, but that's when we may have a video camera pointed at the front door, or the exterior of the home is lit up like a football stadium, or we've got witnesses who can identify a description of a suspect. That didn't happen here. This was very complex and complicated. And I do feel that our citizens did their due diligence. And those who called in those 20,000 tips, that's important. But we heard from the chief to continue to do so, because there are other members of society who I'm sure have had conversations with this individual. And I always go back, Joel, and our colleagues and our viewers, to the very basic. If something doesn't look right, sound right, feel right, it's not right. Have the courage to report it. Let our law enforcement, local, state, and federal experts, let them thread it together. Let them analyze it. That's why they're experts at what they do.
STS Nation jumped in to correct the seal. Jonathan Gillum saying that Richard Ramirez was in fact the Night Stalker. The
Night Stalker, yes.
Zodiac Killer was never caught.
Never caught. That's right.
Yeah, and Jonathan, this guy allegedly held a position as a security guard in which he had to provide fingerprints. What's that tell you?
Well, that's huge. I mean, he very well that could be the way that they caught him. They never told us that they had fingerprints of a subject, but I can guarantee you that house probably had fingerprints all over it. I mean, that was a nightmare for a fingerprint collector in that house. So I would think, unless he wore gloves or they were able to somehow in that house put a fingerprint in there, then that would really come out. Remember, even sometimes with rubber gloves, you can still get a fingerprint. It's very incredible. You won't get the DNA from that fingerprint, but if somebody is pressing hard enough on something, it is possible to get a fingerprint even through rubber gloves. So that could play a part of it. They could have his DNA, in which that would play out. I think there's probably a little bit more to this than what they're telling us, and how they identified that car, and that probably led them, if they got cameras and were able to follow that car that they saw that night to a location where it parked, they can then scan that area for phones, and then you start looking at people, and that could have been where it started. I know for a fact that once they keyed in on this guy, he was never out of the view of agents and police officers. Once we key in on somebody, there's surveillance on that person 24/7. So I'm absolutely positive once they identified him, whether it's through fingernails or DNA or fingerprints, we locked onto him. We never let go of him.
There's a new comment up here. There's been a lot of talk about two stabbing murderers. Pause of Peace writes, could he, meaning this suspected killer, be good for two unsolved knife murders in Washington State? Troy, I'm interested to get your take on this. An older woman in 2020 and a married couple in 2021, where the wife survived the Idaho student murders 2022. I believe there was also a murder way back in 99. But Troy, what do we know about these cases? You're close to the area and you're interested in the field. I believe at one point law enforcement said they were not connected. Does this raise any suspicions?
Well, I would say it depends on where he was at that time. He was a PhD student at Washington State, so the question is, how long has he been there? And because I can't remember when they said that he graduated from his master's in Pennsylvania, but of course, some of those could be completed remotely, so it's kind of hard to say like where he actually was and where he was living. So I'd say it depends on how long he's actually been in Washington State and in that area. And I believe that those two murders too were a little further apart. He would have had to go a little bit further from home, and this seems like a kind of guy who would want to be within a certain range of his home, kind of like we talked about before, or at least his current residence. The other thing that I wanted to say is that in a lot of those cases, these are that happen in rural areas. There are way fewer cameras than there are in typical cities. So there's not a lot of, we're not going to find a lot of camera evidence. As soon as you leave Moscow, until you get in Pullman, there's a huge area that's pretty desolate. There's not much out there. So unless somebody's watching really closely and actually following him, there's not camera footage and stuff like that out there. That's going to be really difficult to find.
Jim, I'm curious about this. So we talked about the fact that he has or working towards a PhD in criminal justice and a master's in it. So it could give him an advantage in the interview room because he knows stuff that other people wouldn't normally know. But I got a comment sent to me that's not up here, and I'll read it to you. I'm sure almost every criminology major at Washington State University must have been following the murders very closely. It wouldn't have taken long for multiple people in his department to surmise that, hey, this guy owns a white Elantra. His whereabouts around that time seemed suspect. Let me just call the tip in. Law enforcement would have most likely traced his cell phone location to determine and confirm where he was on the night of the murder. Once confirmed, they moved in for the arrest. Could it have backfired on him because his peers knew just as much, if not more, and said, hey, this could be the guy?
Yeah, it's very possible. I can almost guarantee you that his peers we're definitely doing some studying on this and probably comparing notes. I wouldn't be surprised if they were giving some sort of assignment to cover on this and what they thought could have happened. So it may not have taken them long. Also, I'm curious to know how long the suspect has been gone and left Pullman, Washington, to head back to Pennsylvania. You're talking shortly before Thanksgiving. So when exactly was that break? When were they to return back for any final exams? Did he come back? So it may have raised a lot of red flags just by his whereabouts and his mysterious steps after these murders. So I think that's something to look at. But it is a very good idea or a good thought process that his own peers could have called in a tip saying, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. This guy's a little squirrely right now. He's a little weird. He wanted to know about how to get away with a murder, and now he has a white Elantra and he's missing. We need to call this in right away. So it's actually a great thought process there about whoever submitted that question. Kudos. I didn't even think of that one yet.
Next question comes from Maria A81. Dr. Goodman, I'll toss this one to you. Might this arrest have any implications for criminology students in the future? For example, background checks or something else before being allowed to study criminology? Because now we're seeing potentially for the first time someone studying this who wanted to actually carry out some of the sinister things that they were learning.
Right. Well, to Maria and the viewers and the colleagues, that is a tremendous question. And so I started getting a lot of emails and text messages as soon as that was revealed that this individual is a PhD candidate in criminology. And here I am as a criminology professor of bachelor's and master's and beyond degrees. So I could tell you this, that at least in my experience, direct experience of working at colleges and universities, as well as police academies at the recruit level, at the in-service level, career and professional development, that thousands of the men and women with whom I've had the pleasure and privilege of working and teaching and training are today's police chiefs, directors, FBI, DEA, Customs, Marshals, Secret Service, Homeland Security representatives. So I think the totality of those who enter our field truly do so with the highest level of honor and integrity and truly want to make the difference. So for me at the moment, it's definitely something to think about. But now, would we only single out the criminology, criminal justice student? What about the psychology student, sociology? Clearly at police academies, as we all know, there's very extensive, a deep dive into the background. And again, if anything doesn't look right, sound right, feel right, they're not entering the profession, or even during the profession. If there is something of concern, then they are invited to leave. So it's something I'd like to consider, actually, because I don't know if we're now intrusive on students' rights to get an education at whatever level they choose, whether it's a 2-year degree, 4-year, advanced degrees. Will we only single out that audience, or do we make it something now more of a standard or a mandate?
I think what you're going to find there is that what he did utilized very little of what he learned. I mean, in order to go out and murder somebody and figure out how the police work, you don't have to have a degree to do that. So the guy is obviously somebody who has some type of psychopathic, I keep going back to the word Machiavellian, especially after I was on Dr. Phil's show, because he really pointed out that I have a degree in psychology and I was a cop. So that kind of worries me is when she said that there, are we going to start looking at everybody with psychology degrees or law enforcement? I don't think that's the case, but I think it is very important. And I think it's something that we have prolonged because of political correctness, is that we need to start looking at people who show odd and deviant behaviors. Deviant behavior is easy to spot. It's just that we ignore it in a lot of ways because we say, well, that's, we don't want to judge somebody. But when you have somebody who, and this is why I cannot wait, I am chomping at the bit to find out this guy's background, because what he chose to major in and the things that he's now being accused of doing, that in of itself says a tremendous amount about who he is. Not the fact that he was in this program, that he was getting this education and he used that to do this murder. I don't think that's the case, but I don't think that really helped. But what I find fascinating is that he did the murders and something in his psyche pushed him to major in these things. It reminds me how so many criminals that become famous and get into the movies always want to play cops. Former gang members, rappers who were gang members, they end up playing cops on TV. I always found that very interesting. So I look at that kind of in this similar circumstance, that you have somebody who obviously this didn't just occur. He chose this career path probably because he's fascinated by law enforcement and cops and the cat and mouse game. But ultimately, and I wish Phil was here to back me up on this for all the stuff that he's done, but now that this guy is to the point that he's at, this is going to be a cat and mouse game. It's an ego booster for him. And so how do we find the knife? Probably this is pay to play now. You work with this guy and you give him a little bit of recognition and he's going to give you some information. And you actually have to, this is the hard part about interviewing some of these people, is that you actually have to boost his ego. You have to make him think that he is the man. And when you do that, although you can't let them walk all over you, because then they will, they're just like, when you pet a cat, you have to always be aware that a cat may turn around and rabbit kick you, bite you, and run off. And then 10 minutes later is going to come back and try to cuddle with you again, So these people are very similar. You can pet their ego, but you have to remember you're dealing with a killer, a predator. And so you stroke their ego a little bit, but you continue to let them know that you're in charge. And then every once in a while, you bring them down a notch, and then they will react to that because they're not good at being subordinate. So they'll react to that as well. Listen, I gotta jump off here too, guys, because I gotta go do some other stuff. And I want to apologize because I'm constantly on my phone. I'm getting text messages and stuff, but it's an honor to be on with so many incredible people. And Joel, as always, you do an amazing job. And yeah, that's it.
Jonathan, great to have you. For those who don't know, that's Jonathan Gillum, a Navy SEAL, former FBI special agent, and a million other things, an air marshal, and the list goes on. Him and Jim are going to have a bench press contest after this.
I'll probably tear a tendon.
Jonathan, thank you.
All right, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
So
Thanks.
I would, as a broadcast news guy for 27 years, this is not something, if I was sitting in the Fox News chair where I used to work, not something I would bring up, but it's been reported quite widely today. People are saying that the sister of this suspect reportedly lives in very close proximity, even next door to the four who were killed. Jim, I've got to assume that if that is in fact true, investigators are all over this, questioning her, taking evidence, et cetera, right?
Absolutely. If that is true, you can guarantee there's a search warrant going on there as well, because there'll probably be some evidence there. I mean, that would, a lot of people, did he stalk these people? Maybe that's the reason why. Maybe he's had encounters. Maybe he's been at a previous party. I've always thought he tried to ask one of these girls out before, and maybe he was rejected, and that created that rage because they see him with somebody else, and then he's angry about it. I mean, kind of fits with him when he was younger, getting picked on. But I don't know, and I've gotten conflicting reports on that, whether they actually live next door or not. So I don't know which one is true, but I would imagine if it is true, they're already in there looking.
We're going to go probably to the top of the hour and then call it a wrap. But Tara McGavin has an interesting comment here, and I'll throw this one right back to you, Jim. They need to check crimes committed on the way there and back. I don't need to tell you, Jim, this is a big country, and the crime happened on the opposite side of the country from where this suspected killer was caught. So what do investigators need to do now from Idaho to Pennsylvania if any murders occurred during the time frame that he was traveling?
Yeah, Jonathan kind of covered to this a little bit earlier. As they are getting more information, it kind of spider webs out, and it goes. So the FBI is going to take that information, they're going to put it into their databases, they're going to put information out to their field offices, and they're going to look through all the reports to see where there's crimes that were similar to this, and they're going to start trying to link things, and they're going to start covering that. The good thing is you have field offices in all your major metropolitan cities, and then some smaller outlining cities as well. So to be able to cover it from Idaho and Pennsylvania, although it seems very large, that would be a large area to cover if it was just Moscow PD trying to cover those tracks. But when you add all these federal agencies, the help of state law enforcement and local law enforcement, they can usually check a lot of these leads very quickly. So they'll be able to start pulling through those reports, pulling through those records, and kind of dissecting that information a little bit quicker than everybody's probably thinking.
And Dr. Goodman, Phil Waters, the detective who I think has worked well over 400 homicide cases, he said something in passing that this suspected killer ran back to mommy's house in the Poconos. As someone who studies the psychology, what does that tell you that this guy brutally murdered, allegedly, these 4 people and then runs to mommy?
Sure. Well, I think chronologically, he may be of 28 years old. Intellectually, he may do well in the classroom. But in terms of, again, a lot of these great points that are being made by the colleagues is the socialization piece. Is he detached from, at any level, we're either a part of or apart from our own mainstream group, whether that's the family, whether that's the workplace, whether it's the peers and the friends. So for me, as we speak and analyze all of this, I think this is an individual who did not have an attachment to some type of intimacy. And as was mentioned also, would have potentially been enamored by one of the females and may have asked out or to keep the company of. And that rejection piece, if that is what we come to find out happened, guess what? We could be rejected by the entirety of a community, and who will always love us? Who will always be there for us? Our parents, because unconditionally, that's what we do as parents. We love our children no matter what. We know that there are flaws along the way, just as there are with us as adults. But that would not surprise me that after the totality and the magnitude of this horror, he goes back to mom, who's always going to love him and look at him as the apple of her eye.
One thing I thought was interesting in a very tangential way, someone pointed out that both he and Brian Laundrie, with the Gabby Petito case, both were vegans, both followed a very strict meal regimen, and both had the same sun and moon signs, for those of you out there, which is who are into the supernatural. This question here, though, Dr. Goodman, back to you from RCC. Could there be sexual assault involved that had not been disclosed? Do you think a perp like this guy would do all this hard just for sexual needs? Question focused to the doctor.
Yes, I'm going to say yes to that. Why? Because I always like to go back, Joel, and our colleagues and our viewers, to data analytics. The data would point to, when it is a male perpetrator and there are female victims, that there has been some type of sexual violation, either preceding a murder or, as we all know, a deeper, darker, unfortunate element of crime, necrophilia. I do think that the fact that this individual used a knife, and by the way, just as an aside with the knife, I think he has the knife. I think for him, that's a souvenir. He did not relinquish that knife. Our expert detectives, investigators, they'll question him, they'll find the knife. That's my thought there. But yes, there could be some type of sexual detachment that he has in his life. Back to the fantasy, he wants to potentially at least touch or get close to these victims, hence why he chose to use a knife. Just like our other crimes that we could point to throughout history, when it's strangulation, when it's drowning, when it's smothering, when there's a knife, there's touch, there's contact.
Very interesting. The police chief was asked a question Troy, and this is to you, about is the community safe now? And again, I want to be very careful because I don't want to come down on the chief, who just did a phenomenal job. He hedged just a little bit, but I'm curious, are you getting the sense now in Idaho that people feel a major sense of relief and the worst is behind them? Or is there fear still or trepidation still that, these so-called other arrests, or there could be other perps out there related to this, are still lingering? Or is the sense that it has been wrapped up enough?
I think it's a combination of both. I think there's a sense that it's been wrapped up to a certain extent. Hopefully we know who did these crimes. I mean, I don't think they would have gone to this trouble to arrest him on this level if it wasn't pretty sure thing. And who knows how these other arrests may be related. But I think there's still a heightened sense of security. This isn't the type of crime that usually happens in Moscow, Idaho. We don't have murders. We have an extremely low crime rate overall. Kids were leaving their doors unlocked, letting people wander in and out, all kinds of stuff, my wife, who's from Chicago, was absolutely horrified by those things, right? But in a small town, that was somewhat of a normal occurrence. So I think there's a sense of relief, like this, at least this crime has been resolved. But I think there's a heightened sense of security and, hey, maybe we should lock our doors. Maybe we should pay attention to these things better than we have been, because this is something that now can touch us where we live.
And there was a source who sent me some information that the FBI out of Philadelphia, Jim, had been surveilling him for at least the last 4 days. Whether that is accurate or not, I cannot confirm it. They also say that the DNA matched material at the scene. There was a bolo out for this white Hyundai Elantra. Apparently, they did find a car very similar in make and model there. So what does that tell you in terms of how the investigators were keying in on key evidence?
Well, this goes to one of my beliefs. You have the victims with known defense wounds. So I wouldn't be surprised if they got some of his DNA underneath the fingernails, or there was some sort of mixed blood. There was something that was left behind. They got that back. They ran it through a system called CODIS, which is a DNA matching, and they got a hit on that. Once they get that kind of information, it's not uncommon if the FBI is involved. They have some incredible surveillance teams, so much so that you have no idea they're even watching you, and you can be looking for them. So I wouldn't be a bit surprised they watch them for a few days, wait for the best opportunity to when they can go ahead and effect this arrest without any other violence taking place, which would make sense for why they hit it at 3:45 in the morning. They knew he would be sleeping at that point, and that was the lowest risk for anyone involved. And they went and did a great job on that. So that just goes to show that cooperation that they have, good evidence collecting at the crime scene. So I think that fits very well with what I would think happened here in this case.
One more question here / comment, and then we'll get some final thoughts, and we'll call it a wrap ourselves until tomorrow, and we'll do another show on the very latest. There are reports out there, and again, if I was sitting in the Fox News Channel chair where I once sat, I would probably not report this. But since I am now sitting in my own studio on YouTube, and I'm able to, there are multiple reports swirling that he was in fact the father of one child. Not corroborated, not confirmed, but right away, Dr. Goodman, that was for you. I saw you make a strange facial expression. How would that change your thoughts if he is in fact a father?
Wow. So meaning then one of our female victims is the mother, or not necessarily?
No. I think he was just maybe a single dad from what the report, there are reports unconfirmed. Right.
Well, if it were to be confirmed, and if we're in this individual's mindset and mind frame, is he thinking that some way, somehow, if it wasn't part of his plan, meaning his plan of getting his credentials, his academics and so forth, then he may have had the enrage and outrage toward the child, but I can tell you I have been involved in those cases where one would think that if that is where the animosity and such would arise, that the child would be the target. However, we do call that displacement, that sometimes individuals will want to commit suicide, or they'll want to lash out at who or what they think is directly causing their own internal or external pain and suffering. So it's an intriguing theory. Let's see if that's accurate.
One person writes, I smell an accomplice. So let's get to some final thoughts. And I'll start again with you, Dr. Goodman. Your take on this alleged murder suspect. Do police have the right man? Is this who you thought he was?
Yes. So about the police, I again want to just thank them from our family to them, to their family, the enormity of what had to go on here in these 6 weeks of day and night, being so thoughtful, so meticulous, so adhering to letter to the law, making sure that really at all the levels, local, state, federal, they truly deserve the accolades, as do, again, those viewers and citizens who rose to the occasion, who had the courage to make the calls and send in the tips. So I feel strongly in our criminal justice system, and I do not believe that we would see this arrest that occurred today with this individual had every layer and level of our field been with certainty. So thank you to everybody who's been involved, and once again, who will continue to be involved, because that call to action is still being made for individuals who know anything, even if they think it's somehow minutia or just minuscule, or law enforcement, they don't need to know this. Send it in, so important. And as always, Joel, Carmela, Steve, and our esteemed colleagues, I'm delighted to join, and to our viewers who are emailing me and connecting, following on LinkedIn, by all means, I take time out of the day to answer every question. And I'm going to sign off, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Goodman. Jim, to you, walk us through the next couple of days. There's an extradition hearing, I believe, on Tuesday, on January 3rd. This person is sitting in a jail cell in northeastern Pennsylvania, a couple thousand miles away from Idaho. What is his life going to look like the next couple of days, and what are investigators' lives going to look like the next couple of days?
Well, we got to find out if he's going to waive extradition. That's going to be the first thing, because then we know if we have a legal battle going on in Idaho, that would take, extend this process out until a judge's signature. It wouldn't extend it more than a week or two, in my opinion. But what I think is happening, he's going to sit in the cell by himself. Investigators are going to try to talk to him unless he's already lawyered up. If he's lawyered up, I'm sure they're not going to let him talk. So that ended up being a dead end road, unfortunately. But law enforcement back in Idaho is going to keep processing the scene, keep processing their information. I'm sure they have hundreds of tips, but even thousands of tips that have come in since he was arrested. I mean, you don't even know where he stayed along his journey from Washington all the way back to Pennsylvania, who he stopped and stayed with, what they observed. So I think a lot of information is going to come forward that's going to be very interesting over the next few days. Unfortunately, all of us are going to sit here and wait for him to get back to Idaho so we can see what's in that arrest affidavit and what exactly took place, so they can legally talk about what has happened at this point. So it's going to be a waiting game. Law enforcement is going to continue doing their job. It's not over yet. It seems like they're still out there arresting more people that were involved that may have either been a part of the crime or had lied to law enforcement. So the work is just beginning. The good news is that I feel very, very confident that if law enforcement and the FBI have gone ahead and made an arrest on this with such certainty of who committed the murders, I feel very, very confident that that evidence is incredibly strong and not one that will be beat in court.
And Jim, I appreciate you coming on under such frenetic circumstances. I do hope you will come back during calmer times, maybe even over the weekend. We'll be covering this throughout the weekend. What is the name of your company? You do consulting now.
I do. It's Jim Rathman, the company. I like to work on a lot of cold cases. I try to investigate and give people answers that they don't have. And sometimes it's a suicide that they just don't want to accept, and I break it down for them. And other times it's a cold case, and I'm able to actually actively work, try to follow some new leads, and turn that back over to law enforcement to get a conviction. I've been successful so far, and I'm going to continue doing that the best I can. All the victims need a voice, and they need justice, and so do the families. They need closure so they can move on.
Doing yeoman's work, Jim Rathman, the company, and there is divine intervention because out of nowhere, Phil Waters shows back up for the final comment here before we close it out. Take care, Jim. Before we close it out with Troy, Phil, I asked Jim this question, but now that he's not on, I'm going to ask you the exact same question. What happens with the investigation? This suspect is not due in court until Tuesday. What happens with investigators, and what happens to this guy sitting in jail in Northeast Pennsylvania over the next several days till the next court hearing?
Well, the first part is if he doesn't waive extradition, he's going to get extradited. They'll do they'll start the process in Idaho through the governor's office, and they'll get him back to Idaho as quickly as they can. But again, look, the process moves the way it moves. And again, I've said from the beginning, this doesn't get resolved in 43 minutes without commercials. So people have got to be patient. I'm going to continue to say that. And I think that this is such a huge step forward that I'm proud of those guys. I think I said it before, but I'm just proud of the guys that put their nose to the grindstone. I've been on these cases that went on for days and weeks and months, and there's very little sleep involved with those detectives. There's a lot of people putting in a lot of hours, and there's no discussion about overtime and cost and all that crap, because it's all about getting to the right person who did the wrong thing. And so I think from here on out, people, again, are going to have to be patient, because I guarantee you this prosecutor is not going to he's not going to quickly go through this. This is going to be just like the investigation was methodical. The prosecution is going to be methodical. They are going to dot every I and cross every T, and they're going to come up with a variety of defenses. Whoever the defense attorneys end up in this thing, good luck. So now again, remember, our system of justice is that he's innocent until proven guilty. So I do want to remind people of that. But everything right now at this point indicates that they do have the correct suspect in custody, and then we will just have to see the process move forward, and he will get his day in court. What I'm interested to see if he is willing to speak with detectives. And if he is, that is going to be a very interesting discussion.
And I just want to say, some people were presumed guilty before their innocence. I'm talking about the so-called hoodie guy, Jack Showalter, talking about Jack DeCur, the on-again, off-again boyfriend. We heard their names thrown around an awful lot. And so, I think it's incumbent on everyone to be careful moving forward, us too. And it's got to be a major relief. There was a story, I guess, a week or two ago about how Jack DeCur was just devastated by this news. People said, oh, he's just faking it, crocodile tears. But
yeah, Joel, can I address that?
Yeah, please.
This is one of the most disturbing things about the social media and so forth and so on, is these folks that do nothing but troll a response because of the most negative or harmful thing that they can say. Those people are despicable. They're probably at home in their parents' basement, and that's all they do all night long. So, and that young man, the ex-boyfriend, the family members themselves, other people, I think there was a professor there where somebody was, trying to say, I don't think they have any concept of the damage that they do to people. They did damage to the investigation. They did damage to the families involved in this thing. They did damage to people that had nothing to do with this event at all in any way, shape, or form. And you cannot, once that happens, you cannot unring that bell. So it's like the age-old question, especially for this young man, this the boyfriend, the ex-boyfriend, where does he go to get his reputation back, to get his good name back? And there is nowhere he can go, because I will tell you, 10 years from now, there will still be people out there that will think he had something to do with this.
Absolutely.
And it just amazes me that the lack of compassion and the lack of empathy some of these people have that get online and just say stuff for the sake of saying it. So it's a shame. And I'll tell you, and I'll add this to it too, because they were very, very hard on that chief and on the Moscow Police Department. I mean, bashing that man, calling for his resignation, calling for his head on a platter. I have from the beginning been supportive of him and confident that this investigation was going to turn out the right way, confident of that police department and the people leading it, the detectives and so forth and so on. And I want to point this out, that today in that press conference, and I hope people understand it and realize it, the incredible amount of grace that chief showed all of these people that were disparaging him, being disrespectful to him, and asking for his destruction. He showed an incredible amount of grace and kept his composure throughout that presser, said what needed to be said what he could say, and we're moving on to a successful prosecution. So I think that needs to be said for that chief and that department.
Amen. One other sort of practical question for you, Phil, before you run. This horrific quadruple homicide happened on November 13th. Today is December 30th. Any chance, if he was injured, had gashes or cuts on his hand, that those injuries are still present and something that investigators could key in on?
Well, when we talked before, I've talked about in bladed weapon, edged weapon events, homicides that I've worked, there's always the possibility, in fact, more times than not, where the person is injured when they're making their strikes with that weapon. So there is a possibility, certainly, that there is some blood evidence left at that scene. Now, in terms of there being any marks left, there might be. I mean, there is the possibility. I had a guy that he ended up with a burn, but it was weeks later. In fact, it was months later, and he still had scarring on his arm as a result of the burn. So depending on the type of wound that he may have, put on himself, there may be a scarring tissue. There may be something there that would indicate that, yes, that occurred. So, yeah, that would be another great piece of evidence.
And Phil, I know you'll like this comment from Jimmy May. Law enforcement gets an A+.
Ditto. Good for you, Jimmy. Appreciate that.
And lastly, to Troy Lambert, you live in Idaho. Your stepson just graduated from the University of Idaho. Are you breathing a sigh of relief? And what are your final thoughts?
Well, first of all, I kind of want to echo what Phil said in that basically law enforcement deserves all the kudos in this particular case. And some of the internet sleuths out there that were making, statements as far as individual people and doing investigations into accusing professors and various different people. Really, at this point, and I'm a fiction writer, right? And so my imagination goes wild with these type of things. But it doesn't mean that I can start naming people in real life. There's no way those people can get their reputations back. And I really feel the same way about the police chief. He deserves huge kudos for having so much grace. It would have been very easy for him to come out and say, "Ha, I told you so," in that presser today, and really slam those people that have been his critics. I've been supportive of the Moscow Police Department. And I do know, too, that the state of Idaho has a tremendous investigative team that's part of the state police. We live in a very rural area. There's counties and places that don't have their own law enforcement teams, and those state police step up and do an awesome job in those places, and bringing in the FBI and all of that support and all the man hours. We as the people of Idaho can't help but be appreciative of that. Those are huge sacrifices. There's time when there's no sleep, there's no rest. You're pursuing one goal. Everybody's pursuing the same goal together. So, and in that way, yeah, we're breathing a sigh of relief. It's the state of Idaho, but I think we're also holding our breath. I want to see if this guy waives extradition. I want him back in the state. I want to hear about the arrest warrant, the affidavit. I want to hear about this guy's background. And I'm the same way also as Phil in that I want to see if he'll actually talk to police, and let's hear what his story is, what in the world was going on inside of his head. That's the thing that's bothered me the most since the beginning of this has been motive. I was on the show before, and that's what we talked about. Motive is the biggest thing that bothers me, is why these college kids, and whether that's because, as the rumor says, that his sister lived next door, or whatever the reason is that he came in contact with them, I would like to know. So I think we're breathing a sigh of relief, but I want more information. I want this to come to a clear resolution, and I'd like to know the end details, the end game.
And we will be all over the information. Very well said. We are going to be doing 2 live shows over the weekend on Saturday and Sunday, even though my producer, aka my wife, is just finding that out right now and is staring at me. Please check out Troy's books, the Max Boucher Murder Mysteries. He writes about this. It's crazy that reality can be even more bizarre than fiction, right, Troy? And really appreciate having you guys on. We've got the legend detective. I was going to call you Dr. Phil. Detective Phil Waters.
I can tell you Dr. Phil's story, though, one day, Joel. Pretty entertaining.
We're going to do an episode on that. Got Troy Lambert, Jim Rathman that joined us. We've got Jonathan Gillum that was here, and Dr. Debbie Goodman. Thanks to all of you. Don't worry. We'll be back tomorrow with another live episode on the latest developments regarding the Idaho quadruple homicide. But for now, love you, America. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everybody.